Welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Julie Hill. I'm a horticulture outreach specialist for Walworth, Rock, and Jefferson counties. I'll help moderate today's session, and we have Darren Kimbler here today, also a horticulture outreach specialist from way up in Iron County, so he'll be also moderating today. And just a few things before we get started with the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature that you should be able to find that at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop, or if you're using another mobile device, just tap your screen and the menu should come up. Please put your questions in there for our presenter, Lisa, today, and we'll get to as many questions as we can towards the end of the presentation. We are recording this webinar. The recording will be on our horticulture website, Extension Horticulture website, in a few days after it's closed caption. So if you miss anything or want to rewatch it again, please just watch the recording. And Lisa, I am going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. Well, today I'm going to be talking about tips for getting landscape plants ready for winter. So it's just landscapes. We're not talking about lawns or vegetable gardens or any of those topics. So this will be trees, shrubs, and perennials for the most part. And here we go. So we'll start out by talking about evergreens. And evergreens are something you should definitely be concerned about in the fall. The biggest thing you need to do is make sure that you're watering, and that's to prevent winter burn. And a lot of people think that, once we get to fall, that plants don't need water anymore, but they do, particularly evergreens. It's really important that they go into the winter being hydrated. So if you have an established plant, provide at least an inch of water minimum per week if it doesn't rain, up until at least mid-November. Now, if you have newly planted evergreens, so those that have been in the ground for 3 years or less, including ones planted this year, then those should probably receive about 2 inches of water a week if it does not rain. And particularly if it's been dry. And I know in some places in the state it has been super dry. Other areas, not so much, but if we don't get an inch of rain a week, that's what you should provide. Now, it's particularly important for evergreens on the south or west side of the house, especially if it's right up against the wall. You can see that this dwarf Alberta spruce, which is kind of the poster child for winter burn, did not fare well in that kind of situation. So the reason that this happens is that if plants don't go into the winter well hydrated, or if they are just subject to cold weather over the winter and drying winds, you can end up with this happening. It tends to happen when we have a January thaw or something like that, where the air gets warm, the evergreen comes out of dormancy, starts photosynthesizing, starts needing to pull up water from the roots, and it can't because the roots are frozen. So making sure that tissue is well hydrated going into winter is important. Now, another thing you can do if you have plants that you need to protect, particularly broadleaf evergreens that are marginally hardy, like Pyrrhus or Kalmia or Chamaecyparis, which is false cypress, and particularly Japanese umbrella pine, because those really aren't very hardy here at all. You might consider tenting with burlap. You put in some stakes. They can be metal fence posts, or they can be wooden stakes that you pound into the ground, and then you put basically a burlap tent around it. You can fasten those with zip ties through the burlap, making sure that it's taut, and that will help protect your evergreen from those winds. In general, we don't want you to put burlap over the top, but if you have to, if it's a Chamaecyparis or something that does not take winter sun at all, make sure that it's really taut and watch for heavy snow load. You just don't want it like sagging and flattening the top of the plant. Now, there are some products out there that you can spend a bit of cash on. They're a bit spendy sometimes, but If they fit your evergreen, it's a lot less work. So there are a number of companies that produce those sorts of shrub protectors. Garden Supply is one that I've seen it at, but there are certainly others. Now I'm just going to give a teaser here for Diana Alfuth's talk coming up next week, because one of the things you want to do early in the season, so like November, is protect your evergreens against rodent, rabbit, and deer damage. And it's not just evergreens, it's younger trees. There are some shrubs like burning bush that tend to be tasty for critters. And you want to avoid the kind of situation that you see in the photo there. So do be sure and listen to the next mini webinar from Diana for details about how to do that. Now, another thing about evergreens is snow load, particularly things like arborvitae. And arborvitae sometimes can tend to split with heavy snow load, although I've also seen upright yews get damaged or at least heavily bent. So things that you can do are to proactively tie up the arborvitae with strips from old t-shirts, like in the picture there. You can use old pantyhose. You can even use thicker bungee cords, but you don't want to tie anything too tightly. It's just basically to kind of help keep it in line. You don't want to use twine either, because that can cut into the branches. So not tying too tight, but using a kind of softer tie is what's recommended. You also don't want to just do one long spiral. You should do several ties on the way up about 2 feet apart. And also don't wait until January to do this when temperatures are very cold and everything is frozen. On the other hand, you don't want to do it quite yet either, unless you're up north and snow may already be threatening. But down here in the southern part of the state, you probably don't want to do this until early December, unless heavy snow is forecast before that. Now, if you didn't tie up your evergreens, and that's fine if you didn't, but sometimes you can end up with this kind of situation where you've got a heavy snow load on the evergreens. You want to take care with doing it, because if you remove it improperly, you might actually end up making things worse. And if the snow is frozen onto the branches or there's heavy ice underneath it, you don't want to bang on it from the top to dislodge the snow. You want to try and gently broom off the branches, sweeping upward so that the branch is supported. And don't shake the tree or shrub either. Do keep in mind also that often trees that are bent will recover later on. Now, one question I always get in the fall is, what do I do about my roses? How do I protect those for winter? So the first thing that you want to do is clean up any leaves that had black spot or other foliar diseases and dispose of them so the disease doesn't have a place to overwinter. And what you're trying to do with grafted roses, now keep in mind that most of the shrub roses are not grafted and don't need winter protection. But your grafted roses, your hybrid teas, floribundas, etc., will have a big knobby graft at the base. And you want to mound bark mulch or leaves over that graft. You want to wait until a couple of hard freezes to do that. You don't want to do it too early because you can get rotting happening. And then consider whether you're going to need to do fencing as well. If you don't have a whole lot of wildlife issues, you can probably just leave it like that. But if you have heavy rabbit pressure or something like that, you may want to fence it as well. And generally, we cut back the roses a little bit in the fall, but we have most of our pruning waiting until spring, when we can see what has survived and what has not. So for the shrub roses in particular, you don't need to do a whole lot of pruning for winter. Now, flower beds, there are a bunch of things that need to be done. If you have any dieback shrubs such as butterfly bush or caryopteris, chase tree, big leaf hydrangea cultivars, most of these should be left up. You can cut back Russian sage to about 18 inches. Butterfly bush, you can probably cut back to about 2 feet if you have a larger variety. Caryopteris, about 18 to 20 inches. Chase tree, also about 2 feet. So, you don't do a whole lot of pruning with these, because they're going to die back to varying degrees, and you want to maintain as much of the structure as will come back. Now, sometimes they'll die back to the ground. I've seen chase tree do that, for example, and also the butterfly bush. And so sometimes they will die back to the ground. Sometimes they won't make it at all. Sometimes I think it should be not just die back shrubs, but die over winter shrubs, because they are somewhat marginally hardy. Now, if you want to protect as much of the structure as you can, do use like a large plastic pot or a rose cone or a bushel basket over the top, and then check in spring. You don't want to have them roasting under the cover. So particularly if you're using a black pot, you want to check frequently. And once the plant starts to bud out, you take off the cover permanently, and you start looking for where you can cut what tissue is dead and what tissue is alive. And we have other perennials. Bearded iris, if you're going to divide them, that should be done usually September to October. I don't like to go too much past the middle of October, at least down here in the southern part of the state, southern central part of the state, because you do want them to get rooted in again, ideally. So you cut back the foliage to 3 to 4 inches, and when you're replanting, you make sure that half of that rhizome is above and half of it is below the soil grade. And you may need to kind of use a sod staple or something else if they are kind of tippy to keep them in place. And you can still do, at least in the southern and central part of the state, you can still do some division of perennials at this time of year. Hostas, ornamental grasses, daylilies, those can all still be divided at this time of year. This late in the season, daylilies may not bloom next year if you divide them now, but they certainly will come back because they're pretty tough plants. Lily bulbs, Asiatic lilies, trumpet lilies, oriental lilies, et cetera, all of those should be divided in fall if you're going to divide them, as well as spring bulbs like daffodils or, well, primarily daffodils. You're going to divide those in fall as well. And plants with semi-evergreen foliage, so like your coral bells or your hellebores, which are the Lenten rose plants, those have semi-evergreen foliage that you don't want to cut back this time of year. That helps to protect their crowns. Now you wait until spring when you see the new foliage coming up, and then you can remove the old foliage. Peonies. These are another plant that should only be divided in fall, like the irises. And generally you want to do that a bit later in fall. So October is fine to do that here in the southern part of the state, as long as we don't have, snow or frozen ground in October, which typically we don't. You can do it up till the end of the month. Now, what you want to make sure of is, after you've done your division, that the eyes, which are the little pink buds for next year, that those are no deeper than 2 inches underground. I would say even 1.5 inches would be a little bit better, because if they're replanted too deep, then sometimes they don't bloom. And each root section should have at least 3 eyes or buds on them. Do keep in mind that the plant probably won't bloom the next year, but usually it will resume blooming the year after that, or maybe even the year after that. Dividing grasses, again, this can still be done this time of year. They need to be divided when you see the kind of donut thing going on where you have the center die out and the edges are still up. So you divide those in early fall to mid-October. Also can do that in spring. Just make sure you have a sharp shovel. And if you're not dividing them, you can either cut them back to 3 to 4 inches in fall or early spring. It's okay to leave material up if you like that for winter interest, but keep in mind some grasses do shatter over winter and then these big pieces start blowing around and it's a pain. So those are usually miscanthus varieties that do that. And you can use head shears, motorized or hand, or scissors. You may want to wear gloves though. Mums, this is the easiest one of all. Don't do nothing. Just leave them alone. They should not be cut to the ground in fall because leaving the stems up helps protect those crowns. Now, if you got a super tall one, you can cut it down to 12 inches, but no more than that. If you have annuals, obviously those should be removed, shake off the soil, compost them. Other perennials, ideally, you're going to want to cut those back in October or early November after they're died off with frost. Make sure that you remove any diseased material like asters or monarda that's had powdery mildew. You want to get that out of there and don't compost it. You can leave some seed heads up for birds if you like, for coneflowers or rudbeckia, etc. And mulch, you want to make sure that winter mulch, if you're doing winter mulch, the idea with winter mulch is you apply it after the soil is frozen in order to keep the soil frozen so that plants don't go through that freeze-thaw cycle, which can heave newly planted or small plants out of the ground. Now, if you've already got bark mulch down, you don't need to necessarily put on any more. If you do have marginally hardy plants, you can put pots over those for the winter, weighed down with a brick or something. And again, with leaf cleanup, there's kind of two schools of thought with leaving leaves on. If you've got leaves that are not going to mat down and deprive crowns of oxygen during the spring when they're trying to come up, then you can leave those on. But keep in mind, if you leave them on too long in the spring, you may have plants starting to come up that you may end up beheading when you rake the leaves out. If you do have something like a Norway maple with big flat leaves that are going to mat down, I would definitely get those out of there. But otherwise, you can leave on until early April, depending on the types of plants that you have there. If you have a lot of bulbs, you may need to move it before that. And do check for jumping worms in fallen leaves. And we'll finish up here with tool care. Now, I know that if you're like me, you probably just finish up the season and, hang up your tools in the garage. But if you want to take really good care of your tools, that does help extend their life. It's a great time of year to, sharpen the shovels up with a steel file. Make sure that you're cleaning off dirt. You can use steel wool if you want to do that. If you're really going to get fancy, you can wipe them or spray them with a petroleum-based lubricant or a rust inhibitor sort of thing. And we do have a really nice fact sheet on this that you can find. Actually, I believe that one may have been moved to the Wisconsin Horticulture site at this point. And then if you do have a rain barrel, be sure that you don't end up having the water freeze in it over winter and have the vessel crack. So you want to dump out the water and store or unhook the plant from the the barrel from the downspout. Hoses should be drained and stored, and expandable ones, ideally you're going to bring those in before a super hard freeze. And then pots, if they're clay or ceramic, should be brought in before a freeze to avoid cracking. And that is that, and I will be happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Lisa. We do have several or a bunch of questions coming in. Before we get to those, I want to remind everybody that we are recording this. The recording will be on the Extension Horticulture website by next week, and so you can review it there. I also posted a link to the evaluation survey. We would love for you just to take a few minutes of your time to give us some feedback about this webinar and other topics that you're interested in learning about. So let's look at some questions. I know you talked about watering, Lisa. Can you just kind of elaborate on maybe how long do you water for to equal an inch of water, or how do you know you're watering an inch of water?
Yeah, that is kind of a tough one. If you were using a sprinkler, and I don't really advocate using sprinklers on trees and shrubs, then you'd be able to run it for a certain amount of time. There is a bit of a formula that you can use that might help you with something like arborvitae. If you measure from the base of the plant to 4.5 feet up, and then you measure the diameter of the plant, the idea is that you would need 10 gallons per inch of caliper. Now, if we're talking about a shrub, that's a little bit more difficult. I would say if you have a 5-foot shrub, it should definitely get at least 10 gallons of water. So in trying to figure out whether you've got an inch, first of all, make sure that you're watering the entire drip zone. And other than that, it can be kind of difficult if you feel like you don't have a way to kind of ballpark that, then just get a couple of 5-gallon buckets and water slowly and evenly around that drip zone. Putting down an inch of water is something that you kind of get experience with over time and are able to sort of eyeball. One thing you can do, though, if you do have mulch down, you can look at the, kind of dig through the mulch and make sure that you're getting the mulch all the way through to the soil. So if you've got 2 inches of mulch and you've put down an inch of water, you want to make sure that is still getting through that mulch. So that might be another way to kind of gauge whether you're actually getting the plant's needs met.
Okay, and is it the same for fruit trees? There was a follow-up question to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would use the same formula for fruit trees.
Great. There's a rose question here. I know you talked a little bit about roses. What about those cones for roses? Do you recommend the cones? Yeah,
that's kind of a sticky question. There are some horticulturists that do, and there are some that don't. The problem with rose cones is that sometimes in the early spring, they can heat up too much. And then you can kind of end up either pushing the growth on the plant or actually frying new growth on your rose. So if you get rose cones, I would get ones that have the lid that you can take off, and then you're just going to have to kind of monitor that. You may want to just leave the circumference of the cone on and leave the lid off as soon as we start to get some warm temperatures in spring. And you may decide to take the cone off if you decide to use one early in the season, like sometime in March. And then if you see budding out and you need to protect them, put the cone back on. But many horticulturists will say don't use a cone. For a shrub rose, it's probably not going to need it. But like a knockout rose that dies back to the ground, or a floribunda or a hybrid tea, those are better off with mounding. And you don't really need to use a cone on top of mounding.
Okay. Good advice. I have some hosta questions for you, so I'm going to combine them.
All right.
There was a few about what to do with hostas right now. Should you cut them back or leave them for spring? And the other hosta question was what to do after you've divided them for successful replanting.
Okay. All right. So we'll start with what to do now. My personal feeling is if the foliage is still green, let them keep photosynthesizing as long as you can. I've got some that have now turned yellow and I'm going to cut those back. But usually I try and wait with any of my perennials until a hard freeze so that I know that they've made as much food for themselves as they can for the next year and are able to draw down as many carbohydrates into their roots to store over winter as possible. I don't like to cut things back any earlier than necessary, although that sometimes puts me in a bit of a time crunch when the weather decides to go south or maybe north earlier than intended. If you're, I think the second question was about replanting.
Yes.
Okay. So for replanting, you want to make your hole, I like to make it about twice the size of the root ball. So, you know, it doesn't need to be a huge hole, but you do want to give the roots a place to expand, particularly if you've got heavier clay. And then you refill the hole with usually soil native to the site. Usually you don't need to add a whole lot of compost, although unlike trees, you can with perennials add some compost or other amendment to the hole. But I would mix it in really well with the native soil. Then just make sure that you've watered the plant in and that you keep watering if we're not getting at least an inch of water a week. If the weather should get really warm again, you need to check it more than once a week to make sure that it's getting sufficient water.
Okay. Darren, any burning questions that Lisa can answer from you?
Well, a couple of different people early on were wanting to know about dahlia bulbs and probably just bulbs in general and on storing them over the winter.
Okay, so we'd be talking about things like cannas, dahlias, gladiolas, those kinds of things. There are different bulbs need different care. And since we've talked about, or the question was about dahlias, I'll answer that one. Dahlias should be dug up and you can leave, you know, a couple, 3 inches of stem, knock as much of the soil off as you can and be a little bit careful with them because the tubers are a little bit brittle. If you're going to divide them, look for the little swellings at the end of the tuber where it connects to the stem. And those are the buds for next year. If you just cut off the tuber without any buds, it's just a storage organ. It doesn't have the tissues to be able to regenerate a stem. So you need to be really careful about that. If you just want to dig up the whole clump as is and then replant it next year, that's fine. Usually storing them in peat moss that is barely moist. You don't want it to be super wet, but moist enough so that they don't dry out. And that may entail checking them a couple times a month or maybe just once a month. Now, you don't want to put them down in your basement if your basement is 65, 70 degrees. You should be storing them in more like 55 degrees, ideally. So if you have a root cellar or something like that. Now, they may do okay in 65 degrees, but what you don't want to happen is have them start growing over winter and producing a bunch of weak, spindly growth. So you just want to keep them from drying out. You want to keep them someplace that's relatively dark and check on them every now and then.
All right. Well, it looks like we're pretty much at the end of our presentation today, our time allotted. In the chat, Julie has just added a link to our survey so that we can better serve everyone with topics. So please take a few moments to click on that link and fill out that survey to help us help you. So everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.